welcome all, welcome. Lamentations, our very first session. To begin with, I'd like to know what you on the chat bubble think about Lamentations. What are your general impressions when you talk about this book? Anybody jump online, just give me a few thoughts around what you think of Lamentations.
Written by a very sad person.
A very sad person, exactly.
But it has little messages of hope in it.
Oh, good. Yeah, you're right there, Ruth. It does have little messages of hope. It's one of those fantastic things, isn't it? You go through like huge passages of like, whoa, I don't want to look at that. And then like, hey, that's my favorite verse ever. Yeah, absolutely.
But he also expresses his sorrow for the city of Jerusalem.
Yep. I think you're touching on a very good point there as well, Uncle Dave, where when we look further into it over the next few weeks, we'll see what comes out very, very strongly. Jeremiah does not blame anybody particularly. Like, he doesn't say it's this person's fault, or he doesn't say it's God's fault, etc. He actually takes full responsibility in the way that he looks at what's gone on. So there are some really, really fantastic lessons that we can start pulling out from Lamentations, even with these general thoughts that we have on the book. Why do we lament? Right. So Steve's saying it's about a very sad person has written it. What makes us lament?
Because you're affected by what happens with your family.
What happened to your family? Brilliant. Yeah. Yep. And I think, Ruth, you say grief. Yeah. So is lamenting a useful emotion? Does it serve a purpose?
Well, grief is a useful emotion.
Yep.
So
do you think it's useful for the
lamentation
person or for the people that hear it?
Particularly for the person who does it.
Right. Yeah.
We've got it, so it must be useful.
Yep.
I like that logic there, Jackie. That yep, definitely. I'll go with that.
Great logic.
So you're right. We do mourn the things that we've lost, right? So we mourn people. Sometimes we mourn places that we've moved away from. Maybe positions, if we're that way inclined. You know, I really love that job that I used to have. All those sort of things. It's not really the sense of mourning and laments that we get from Lamentations. What we get from Lamentations is very much about death, about the decay of a people, of a nation, of a society. Exactly as Steve was saying, like it's the death, it's the grief over family, etc. And that's really what we get out of Lamentations. But I can see from your comments that you brought through, just from a very quick thought about what Lamentations might be, you're already pulling out some of the key aspects of what God is trying to give to us with these 5 chapters here from Jeremiah. So here's the very quick overview. And Ruth, this is not going to help you any further, is it? So tonight is the background, and then chapters 1 through 5. So that was very nasty of me. This might help you though. If we look at the tone of the book, what's the key tone, or the couple of key tones of the book that come through? Now, because it's a Hebrew Bible, so think of what the Hebrews used to do with their books in the Torah, etc., and how they made the first word of every book was the name they gave to that book. And that's exactly what they do here with Lamentations, right? So the key tone of the book to the Jews, to the Hebrews, was "Ha!" as an exclamation. What on earth has gone on here? You know, like with Genesis, it's beginning, and they do it with a lot of other books, and here with Lamentations, they do the same thing. The first word, that becomes the key theme, the way that they call the book itself. And that comes out in 3 chapters there. If you see those on the notes, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 4. All those chapters begin with, in the Hebrew, the word how, or some of your translations might have alas. That comes through quite a lot, both in Lamentations and in other prophecies too. But this is how the Jews decided to like name the book. That's what they saw as being the message that came through. Okay. And as we've just talked about, because we lament things that die, particularly people that die, this word how in Hebrew, it is an exclamation or of desperation and shock, usually around death itself, okay? Usually about people. But in this instance, the prophet who wrote the book, he's using it about society as well, about a culture, about a city, about all these things that we understand that God cares about. And if you're faithful with God, then you also care about these things. And he's using that same anguish of death about those things. So when we think about, okay, what's this how? What's this? What's going on? Right? Think of how we, in shock or surprise, think about people in passing. Say when we get the announcements on Sunday and brother or sister so-and-so has passed away this week. We're like, what the heck? I didn't even know. What's happened to them? What? Right? So it's that same shock and surprise. Is like, what the news is confusing me. You've got no idea how it's happened. And it's that shock and that uncertainty. So that's the message that's coming through. That's the tone that's coming through with the writer. Now, another tone that does come through quite a lot is around affliction. And it sort of repeats over and over and over. You get a lot of it in chapter 1. There's what do we got there? 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 12. There's about 7 or 8 instances in chapter 1 and in chapter 3 as well. So that's another one of the key tones of Lamentations that comes through. So obviously lamenting something, so something bad or consequential has happened. Therefore, the affliction or the punishment or the action has taken place. And that is seen quite a lot through the first few chapters of Lamentations too. Each chapter has a key element that it deals with about affliction. Right, so chapter 1, and I think, Ruth, if you're looking for your notes to write down titles, here's where we come to this crucial element of titles to each chapter. So take it as a grain of salt, or if you like where I'm going with this, then feel free to use it. Chapter 1, I think, deals with a lot about what that affliction is. Chapter 2 seems to highlight the source of that affliction, where it's come from. Chapter 3 has a really tiny glimmer of hope in affliction. And in all poetic writing, we get this, particularly in Hebrew poetry, it goes from both sides and then works in until we get to the middle. In the middle of chapter 3, as in the middle of Lamentations, that's the key message that he's giving us. And that key message is about 4 or 5 verses on hope. And in chapter 4, it goes back to the reasons of affliction. And in chapter 5, it's just one big prayer about delivery from affliction. Now, to try and show you how I came up with that idea or sort of thought that's what was going on, these are the key phrases which we can often see through these chapters. Okay, so if I'm trying to say, well, we look back, what the affliction is, well, in chapter 1, none shall comfort her. So as you read through chapter 1, take some time to look out for this key theme of either the people she had made alliances with have now turned, so they're not giving her comforts, they're not giving her security, they're not giving her protection. Also, God has departed. So God is no longer comforting and caring for his people. So all through chapter 1, there's the idea of nobody is there to comfort her. Chapter 2, then, the Lord has done this. All through the first 9 verses, you read up and try and spot every occurrence of God in those first 9 verses of chapter 2. And I think it's about 20 to 25 times it's either I have, he has, the Lord has, God has, constantly, I did this, I did this, I did this, to drum it into them, hey, it was God that did this to you. And then we get to chapter 3, and there's 4 verses, 4 times Jeremiah says, I hope. And that hope comes right after this absolutely depressing situation he presents himself in, and then his mindset goes, but then I recall that I'm still alive, I'm still in your presence, therefore I have hope. And it's like that's I want to say juxtaposition, that's a contrast between what he's just said and the hope that he then talks about. It's like bang, just wakes you up to go, heck, the life we have right now is like, it's nothing compared to what he went through, and yet he still hopes. It's incredible. Chapter 4, it does highlight its the sins of the prophets, the sins of the princes, the sins of the elders, the sins of the people that had the responsibility to teach and direct the nation, okay? And for their sins, that's why God is doing it. Then in chapter 5, there's not particularly a key theme that comes through, but I think the very last verse, or last 2 or 3 verses of chapter 5, is that phrase that Jeremiah uses there, remember us, O Lord. Right, he goes all the way through chapter 5, if not through the entire Lamentations, and then says to God, turn us back to you. As if to say, we can't come back to you because we've gone so far away, therefore remember us and turn us back to you. It's incredible when you get to that part of Lamentations 5. So I think there are some really good thoughts to think about. Take some time just to note down those phrases. And if you want to read through the chapters as we go through, even before the classes, and just note down where they come through, and it will just start to make each chapter sort of stand out on its own. And the message, potentially the message that Jeremiah is trying to drive through. There's another interesting characteristic of these Lamentations. They're acrostic poems. Now, I find that really interesting. Bring up the rest as well. So the fact that they're poems, I think, speaks a huge amount about what the writer saw and also the lessons they're trying to get across. Okay, so if the writer was trying to just write a historical summary, they could have very easily just gone, and the Babylonians did this, then this happens, then we responded that way, then that happens, and the priest did this, and rah, 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 rah. And for all of those who don't like reading through history, we'd just go, I'm not reading that, that's just boring, and it means nothing to me. But I think the fact that he's written it as a poem, an acrostic poem, is really, really crucial. It's telling us straight away, hey, here's some poetry, and it's written in the methods that is there to try and help you memorize stuff. So it's got a message and a particular writing style to help us and the Jews at the time to face these circumstances and learn from them. And as he says throughout Lamentations, if not chapter 5 particularly, please never forget. In fact, God, don't forget us as well. The laments, they always end in a prayer. You could say they always end in a prayer. I might be stretching at things here, but I like to think they do. The final prayer of the book is at the end of chapter 5, and I think that one to me is the most memorable. And it's that same verse that I just mentioned before. It's bring us back to yourself, O Lord. Right? So that's the final prayer of this whole lament. After he's gone through all of the other stuff about affliction, then he still says to God, please bring us back to you so that we can return to you. And I do think that there are no excuses or justifications from the writer. He never says it was unfair that these things happened. He never says, oh, we just needed more time. We could have done this. We could have done that. Yes, there are personal writings where he talks about himself in a situation. And it is definitely a depressive writing style when he does that. So you could look at that and say, what are you doing, making excuses? But definitely not. When we start to look at the life of Jeremiah and then understand what he's gone through in his entire life, I think we can very much excuse him for the way that he's writing Lamentations here too. So I truly believe there are no excuses, there are no justifications. It's true soul-searching humility on his part in offering these laments to God. Now we'll come back to the poetry later, because I think that's a really key thing to look at, the style of acrostic poems and understand why that happened. But let's look at the author. Now, no author is given in the Hebrew manuscripts. Jeremiah was acknowledged to be the writer around the 3rd century BC. Okay, so if you're looking at most of our modern translations, they're all saying like the Lamentations of Jeremiah, etc. I believe the AV from memory doesn't refer to him. I'm going off my very dodgy memory when I put these talks together. But the Hebrews never credited Jeremiah with the writer, being the author. It was only around the 3rd century BC where historically they looked back and said, oh, well, it kind of fits, and I think it was him. Now we can look through and see that there are several experiences between Jeremiah and his own prophecy, in his own book, and Lamentations. And we can just, like, there are 2 that I've got there, bearing the yoke and being cast into the pit. So there are 2 which are essentially mirror images of what he writes about in Jeremiah and in Lamentations. Like in Jeremiah 27, the Lord told me to make a yoke of leather straps and wooden bars and put it on my neck. And so he goes away and does that, and then all the people laugh at him and tell him he's a fool. And then there's this false prophet which takes it off and breaks it as well, and declares that the prophecy of burden is now over because he's broken the yoke, for instance. And then God comes back to him and says, right, well, that yoke's broken, yes, but I'm going to put a yoke of iron on the people. And then you look at Lamentations 3. Jeremiah is saying, well, it's actually good for a man to bear a yoke. Now, I know that's not a physical burden of yoke that he's talking about in Lamentations, but in Jeremiah 27, you're seeing a young prophet, maybe 20, 30, I can't put a particular date on it, around chapter 27, but he's bearing a yoke, if not in his prime years. And then he's saying in Lamentations 3, well, hang on, in your youth and your prime years, put that yoke on. And there are lessons that follow from that. Cast into a pit in Jeremiah 38. So he was grabbed and imprisoned because the king and the generals were annoyed that the message from God he was telling them was demoralizing the soldiers. So they grab him and throw him into a cistern, into a well. And it says there in Jeremiah 38, there was no water, only mud. So he sank in the mud. And we know that one of his, I think one of the scribes came along later and pulled him out, put a linen sheet underneath his armpits to pull him out. So if he's sunk in the mud up to his armpits, it's an absolutely haunting thing to think about. You can't even move your entire body So he is literally buried up to his armpits. The same in Lamentations 3:53, my enemies, they hunted me down, they shut me in a pit, they threw stones at me. The same concept. He's been hunted for the things he's saying. He's been shut away in a pit and he can't get away. So by the time he's writing these words in Lamentations, he's well into his 60s by this stage. He's not a young man at all. He's gone through his entire life cycle of prophecy from the time of Jeremiah chapter 1, where we know that God says, I have chosen you while you're still in your mother's womb. So I knew about you before you were born, and I chose you, and then through your entire life, up until Lamentations, his entire life was dedicated to God. Now, when we look at that dedication, also you can see a lot of analogies of sin and death and restoration, etc., between the Jeremiah and Lamentations too. But you can do that on your own time, I think. Once you get further into Lamentations, and then you'll start to see the connections between Jeremiah, the prophecy, and Lamentations. Time of writing. There's a lot of reference to famine, to siege, to vicious attacks that come all the way through Lamentations, which indicates it's just been after this very, very brutal period of war. So if you look at Lamentations chapter 1, verse 11, the people groan as they search for a morsel of bread, as there's no food left in the city. So that's an indication of a very, very long siege over the city, over the country. Verse 19, my lovers, the priests, the elders, they're all searching for food to keep alive. In chapter 2, verse 12, the children are fainting like warriors, dying in their mother's arms. Verse 19, so the women eat their offspring. Right, there's actually nothing left in the city. There's no bread, there's no flour, there's no fruit or vegetables. Everything around the city, everything across the countryside has just been taken and destroyed by the Babylonians over that siege of 3 years to conquer the city. And if you are struggling to stay alive, I think self-preservation is one of those powerful instincts of human nature. Well, women are turning to their babies, not just women, dare say, people turning to eat their offspring. That's how graphic it's getting in that city. That's the indication of how stark and how bad the affliction has gotten in that city. Chapter 4, verse 4, the infants' tongues sticking to the roof of their mouths. You know, we do at times get the images come through from, I don't know, like UNICEF or all those foundations that try and look after the children in third world countries. And you get very much the media images of how sick and starving these children are, these people are. So that's what we need to see come in these verses. That's the image that's being brought through to us, right? So that's the time of writing. It's been after this brutal, brutal siege. And there's a couple of verses which indicate exactly when that siege would have been or could have been, beg your pardon. So Lamentations 2 is talking about the fact that Jerusalem has fallen, but there's still a remnant left. If you have a look at Lamentations 2, verse 9, her city gates have fallen, the bars are smashed, the princes are taken in exile, but the elders are still sitting on the ground in silence. The young women stare at the ground. So there's still some people left in the city. But yet if we look at Jeremiah 52, it says that the final remnants were taken very, very soon after. right? So we read through those last few verses of Jeremiah 52, and it's very, very precise what Nebuchadnezzar does. He comes along, has a siege, destroys the city, takes all the stuff away from the temple, and we know that he's very specific about, I've taken 2 cups, 5 forks, 3 spoons, and he notes it all down. And he does the same thing with the people. In the 7th year, 3,023 people. In the 18th year, 832 people. In the 23rd year, 745 people. Then it's done, right? And it very much aligns with God's prophecies that he gave with Jeremiah to the people, saying, don't flee to Egypt, don't go to places that I don't want you to go to. The whole purpose of Babylon is to take you away from here into captivity. And I'm going to take every single one of you away from here. So there's the hint from Lamentations 2 and Jeremiah 52. This is just between the destruction of the city and when Nebuchadnezzar comes back to take away the final remnants. So I would like to think that Jeremiah is there with the elders and the young women and literally looking at the fallen gates, the smashed bars, and yes, in the horrific way, seeing the famine and the destruction of his people. And I think realizing that really, really brings home the message a lot too. So it makes us understand why it is such a gruesome and graphic writing. I think it's probably slightly important just to have a quick look at his background as well, because that plays a huge part into a mindset of somebody, right? We often do this. Oh, where have you come from? Which city did you live in? Oh, okay. And so, there's a national government at that time. So you're right. And then you had, so we had a bubble, an economic bubble in '87, and then there's a dot-com bubble around 2000. So there are always these indications of what society goes through that people think makes you as a person, that makes your country what it is, makes it respond in certain ways. So I think that same thing can be replicated with Jeremiah too. So he was born near the end of Manasseh's reign. Now, yes, we can say Manasseh became a very faithful man at the end of his reign. And I totally agree with that. I love that story of Manasseh changing to try and fix all the things that he did wrong for the last 50 odd years. But his previous life still haunts the nation, right? Still socially and spiritually, God says, hey, it's your fault that blood flowed through the streets because the people are just doing what they want now. And it was because of you that they're doing these things. So Manasseh was the one that declared allegiance to Assyria. Didn't want God, he made an allegiance with Syria. He loved the foreign ways, Zephaniah tells us. In fact, human sacrifice, right? I did once hear a talk where it was presumed potentially that Hezekiah was a potential attempt at a sacrifice from Manasseh, right? Because maybe there was some sickness in Hezekiah. Now that's a massive tangent and a side piece, but that's the lifestyle that Manasseh brought to society, to Judah, before God took him away and before he tried to restore everything back to God. So Jeremiah is born into this same lifestyle, into this same society. Josiah. So Josiah was the king that Jeremiah started his ministry. In fact, it was around the same time as Josiah's Reformation. You can almost pair up the two timelines when Josiah became old enough to understand that he had to restore the country. And that was around the same time that Jeremiah began his first prophecies. So when you go and read through 2 Chronicles 34, you'll see that Josiah cut down all the idols, he broke all the altars, he burnt the bones of pagan priests. I think, okay, got this really, really positive image of Josiah, and then I'm going, so he's got to dig up the bones, then burn them again to throw dust back in the graves. So this is a righteous man who was trying to show the people and show God, this is what I think of these things. He even went into Israel, like outside of Judah, into Israel to wipe out the influences of the people around him. So he really wanted to preserve Judah and bring Judah back to God. That was his whole drive to try and do that. So that was the society that Jeremiah started to prophesy in. Now we still know Manasseh's lifestyle affects the people throughout Josiah's kingdom, throughout his reign, beg pardon. Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, these guys despised Jeremiah and the prophecies from God. Jehoiakim, for instance, he was the one that Jeremiah had his scribe write up a letter. So he wrote up a whole letter of God's words and God's declarations. Then Jeremiah said, right, now give it to the king. And the king took the scroll, tore it, and then threw it into a fire. And then he sought to imprison Jeremiah and those scribes. So that's the attitude of Jehoiakim and Zedekiah that came after. These guys were just right off the path to go and do whatever they wanted. So this is the society that Jeremiah is now prophesying into. So you think, in his own mental state, what's he going through? What is he dealing with in society? And in his own mindset, he's trying to keep himself on the true, narrow path, right? Yet his society before was evil. Josiah's trying to correct things and then gets a lot of stuff going, but in the background, the people are still doing what they want to do. Then the next king, right back to the same old tricks. How about his own life? What about the things that actually happened to him? So his own family sets out to kill him for the same reasons that the people do. You know, don't like your message, stop saying these things. And they set out to try and kill him, his own family. I think that puts it in perspective. What does God tell him? God says, well, hang on, these people have gotten so bad. There is nobody here that I want you to pray for. Do not pray for any of them. That's as if to say, we've got these pastoral prayers going now, and if the ABs decide, yeah, hang on, we're not doing that anymore. In fact, we're having no prayer for any brother or sister because you're all a bunch of pagans. None of you are up to scratch, and we're not having any personal prayers for any brother or sister because none of you come up to par. The whole purpose of our fellowship is that we think about others, we care for others, we bring the attention of others to God, putting ourselves in the backgrounds, right? And then pushing others forward, pushing others further towards God. That idea of self-sacrifice, of humility. And God is saying to Jeremiah, not for these guys. No, they're not worth it. In fact, they're not worth marrying. Don't even marry one of these people. There is nobody here that is worthy of my consideration. So I don't want you to marry them. So he's gone through a society where the kings and the generals are hating on him, ridiculing him, throwing him in a deep, muddy well. He's been ridiculed. He's been mocked. His prophecies have been torn up and burned. He's been abused by the powers simply because God is still working through him. And then his own family is turning on him too. So keep that in mind as you consider Okay, this prophet may have gone 30 or 40 years, his entire life, under these circumstances. Now, our ecclesia over the last 10, 20 years-ish seems very comfortable and very loving and very, very inviting. And we're so blessed to have that atmosphere, aren't we? So it's very hard to think what it's like to be in Jeremiah's situation. But I think the more that we can consider it, the more we might be able to understand this man suffered so much. And yet his lament is one of shock. It's one of pity. It's one of anguish. And it's one of hope of God's deliverance. There is not a single hint in any of these laments when we look at them that Jeremiah says, you deserve that, right? And I would honestly say any one of us would say at least that once, right? We've gone through that life. We would say in these laments, yeah, they deserve all that. It's their fault. But there's none of that from this man. And I think that there is a powerful and incredible message too. Yes, there are obvious indications of depression. And I can see that coming through in the laments and Lamentations. We definitely can see it come through in his own life throughout Jeremiah. Change in personality, for instance, his very angry prayers, they're very raw with real bitterness when talking to God. I actually like reading those prayers because I find it very comforting that there are faithful men that can communicate with God in such an authentic way. It's not to say let's take that prayer and do it all the time, because there was a mindset and a situation that made Jeremiah do that. But it's comforting to see that God has written that down for us to say, I want you to approach me in any mindset that you are in. He definitely became sluggish. He lacked the self-esteem. He didn't want to perform his tasks at time. And I'm sure you can agree, I can see why that would happen. You get to such a point, it's like, there's no point doing this. They're going to burn another letter. They're going to throw me in a well again. Why am I going to do this? To the point, he says he wished he had never been born. So there are suicidal thoughts. So I can accept, and I really do agree that Jeremiah was incredibly depressed. And it does play into the life that he went through too. And it plays into the affliction that has just gone through Judah and through Jerusalem right now. So possibly poetry to Jeremiah was a form of meditation. And I have no proof of this. I have no backing of it scripturally. But I would like to consider that it may have been one of his modes of trying to bring peace to his mind. Because it's at the very end of his life. It's at the very end of his prophecy here. And he's reverting to giving us poetry. And you would very much think if it was anyone else, would they just shut up and not say a single thing, not even write down a thing. But here is this prophet that has gone through so much, and now he's creating these wonderful pieces of poetry. As a side to fill in that thought, maybe Time magazine, this is going back a few years ago, but they put out this article around meditation and how meditation seems to help regulate the emotions, which in turn helps people to get along. So if you can regulate the emotion, then that in turn helps to act upon our emotional intelligence, right? Meditation, that is. Meditating helps to calm our emotions and help us emotionally interact with better what we call EQ, emotional intelligence. And these skills, getting on emotionally with each other, is a much better set of skills than like IQ, right? So you can know your physics and your chemistry to whatever degree, but it's your emotional intelligence which is much more important. So even scientists and psychologists, etc., like this is 15 years ago, isn't it? 2006. Yeah. So 15 odd years ago, we're writing these things. Psalm 40, I think, is pretty good equivalent from God's point of view. So David there in Psalm 40 says, I relied completely on the Lord, and he turns toward me. He heard my cry for help. He lifted me out of the watery pit, out of the slimy mud. See how much that aligns with Jeremiah. God has turned toward me. He's heard my cry. He's heard my laments to him, and he's pulled me out of the muddy pit. He's placed my feet on a rock and given me secure footing. He gives me reason to sing a new song. See how what David is saying there, that God listening to your laments, listening to your poetry, listening to your ways that you're trying to turn back to him, and he hears that and then gives you new reason to live on. And I truly hope that's what was going on here with Jeremiah too. All right, so these laments are acrostic poems. This is an acrostic poem. The whole point of acrostics is to either take a word or a set of letters, for instance, and then make phrases that relate to that word or to a theme that you're trying to create around that word. For instance, Monday. Okay, nobody likes Mondays, as far as everybody says, oh, I hate Monday. But it's all about attitude, isn't it? So there's one for Monday. Roald Dahl even gets his own ones. I kid you not, when you're trying to look at examples of acrostic poetry on Google, there's a whole bunch of 5-year-old school kids. Put them online. And I think that's the key point that comes out of poetry here, particularly acrostic poetry, is the whole purpose of why it's written. If Ron's online, Ron's going to love this, because Ron's usually the one that goes all lovey-dovey and gushy for love. So there's one on love as well. The point of acrostic poems is, as I say, it takes a word or take a series of letters and then creates your own theme around each of those. Right, so that's exactly what Jeremiah does here with the laments. So the first few chapters of Lamentations, the first 4 chapters, beg your pardon, are acrostic poems. Now, if you've got I guess a more modern translation, you'll see that come through. So it's going to be split into 22 verses. And each verse is essentially its own segment, its own set of information. So chapter 1, chapter 2, 22 verses. Chapter 3 is 66 verses. And I believe in essence what he's trying to do there is say, hey, this chapter is the more important one. And chapter 4 back to 22. Chapter 5 is also 22 verses, but it's not acrostic in its own sense. Touched on that. They all end in a prayer as well. So what you'll find is, if you go back to those other examples of acrostics, or if you ever try and do your own one, like if you take Pakuranga, for instance, and then try and make an acrostic poem out of Pakuranga for the ecclesia, you'll just make sections for, like, the P might be praise, the A might be your adoration. So, okay, we've got P, praise and adoration. They have the same train of thought already, but they still match the letters going through. And then K, kindness. So now we've got a massive tangent away from adoration to kindness. So we've got this huge jump to a different subject. So that's why when we read through acrostic poetry, particularly here in Lamentations, like, what the heck are you doing? What are you saying? I don't see a theme. Like, well, there's not particularly a linear theme. It's just poetry, and you'll see snippets of different things come through each chapter, where you can go, oh, okay, so chapter 1 seems to be based around what the affliction is. Ah, now I've got it. So it's not a continual theme of, affliction is it's just not the way that we naturally write poetry, nor it seems the natural way that Jeremiah wrote the poetry. But it appears that God has chosen this format because it's a really easy way for information to be retained and recalled. Right, so you could write a whole acrostic on Packering or Ecclesia, and then teach it to the Sunday school kids and make them sing a song about it at the Sunday school play, and then 2 years down the road, one of them's going to go, P for praise. Oh, good work, Billy. Right, so he's remembered that because it came from that poetry. And I know this from my own experiences when I did it at intermediate, did one on Antarctica. And there were a few letters there that I really couldn't find any theme of Antarctica, right? So just trying to recall what those words were, and this is 25 years ago, so I can still remember using it that far back. And that's the whole purpose of doing poetry in this way, is that God is trying to show to us, okay, these events, these are crucial to remember, and they have really, really important information in there. They're vital for you to think about. Now, yes, it's coming from a dark place in this prophet's life, but they're not judgmental. They're not full of vengeance. They're not full of bitterness or hatred. And they absolutely do have tiny bits of hope and things for us to focus on and see the light that shines through the darkness. And I think one of those, particularly to end tonight on, is this from Jeremiah himself. This I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Now you put that in perspective with everything we've looked at tonight. And you're like, this man is just like, his faith, his ability to still praise God's faithfulness is astounding. So next week we'll have a look at what affliction is. Thank you, brethren.